November 1929. Daniel McCarthy wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for a way down. The construction foreman stood at the edge of the excavation pit in Boston's North End, staring at something that shouldn't exist. His crew had been digging foundation trenches for a new warehouse when their shovel struck stone. Not bedrock, stone that had been cut, shaped, arranged, and beneath it, darkness. McCarthy lowered himself into the gap, lantern swinging. The light caught carved symbols on the tunnel wall, circles within circles spiraling down into the earth like a throat swallowing itself. The air smelled wrong. Old iron, wet earth, something else he couldn't name but his body recognized as warning. 30 feet below street level in a city where every tunnel, every basement, every cellar had been mapped and documented, McCarthy had found a labyrinth that didn't exist on any city record. A network of passages radiating outward like the spokes of some buried wheel, all converging on a central chamber where the walls themselves seemed to whisper. On the chamber floor, McCarthy found the first of 23 bodies, and on the wall, carved deep into granite, a single phrase repeated in spiraling text: God is the architect of nothing. Before we descend into that darkness together, subscribe to Forbidden History Archives, because some truths were buried for a reason. Comment your city below, so we know where these hidden histories are reaching. Now let's uncover who built this labyrinth, why it existed, and what the man who hated God believed he was creating beneath Boston's streets. The man who built those tunnels was named Silas Thorne. Born in Boston in 1871, Silas grew up in the North End when it was a maze of narrow streets and churches packed so tightly you could hear 3 different sermons from a single corner. His father, Nathaniel, was a stonemason who worked on Trinity Church, one of Boston's most ambitious architectural projects. Nathaniel believed that stone held divine geometry, that architecture was prayer made solid. But when Silas was 7 years old, his mother died in a scaffolding collapse during the church's construction. 12 workers killed. Nathaniel told his son it was God's will. Silas stood at her grave and decided that if God's will required his mother's death to build a house of worship, then God's will was an architecture of cruelty. By 1889, Silas had followed his father into the stonemason's trade. He was gifted, almost supernaturally skilled at understanding underground structures and water flow. When Boston began planning the Tremont Street subway, the first in America, Silas worked on excavation surveys. He learned the city's bones. He learned how to read stone the way others read books. But in 1891, his father died in a tunnel collapse during subway construction. Nathaniel was buried with a church service. The priest spoke of God's plan. Silas saw only waste, a man who dedicated his life to building churches for a society that discarded him the moment his labor was no longer useful. That's when Silas's belief crystallized. God was not a creator, but a jailer. Faith was not liberation, but a maze designed to keep humanity confused and obedient. And if God's architecture was a trap, then the only moral response was to build a counter-architecture, a labyrinth that didn't lead to salvation, but to truth. In 1893, Silas inherited his father's modest estate and purchased, through shell companies, the deed to an abandoned brewery warehouse in the North End. The building sat on unstable fill land, considered unbuildable. For Silas, it was perfect. Between 1894 and 1900, Silas excavated his first tunnels. He worked alone at night, hauling earth up in buckets and dumping it into the harbor. He'd learned from his father how to shore up tunnels, how to prevent collapse, how to read the stone. But he wasn't just digging passages. He was designing them. The layout followed a spiral, a design found in ancient labyrinths, from Crete to Celtic burial mounds. A shape that disoriented by offering infinite paths that all led to the same center. He carved symbols into the walls, inverted crosses, broken angels, architectural diagrams twisted into blasphemy, and everywhere the phrase, God is the architect of nothing. By 1900, the tunnels extended over 300 feet. Multiple chambers, each carved with philosophical statements challenging Christian theology. One dedicated to the lie of salvation, another to the fiction of divine justice. But philosophy alone wasn't enough. Silas needed disciples. He needed others to see what he saw. That's when the disappearances began. Father Michael Corrigan noticed it first in the spring of 1902. Men were vanishing from the North End. Working men. Laborers. The first was Antonio Russo, a dock worker who'd stopped coming to Sunday Mass. His landlord said Russo had paid rent through the month and then disappeared. His belongings were still in his room. The second was James O'Leary, an Irish stoneworker who'd been drinking at a tavern and told the bartender he'd been invited to see something that would change his understanding of the world. He left at 11 p.m. No one saw him again. Father Corrigan brought his concerns to the police in August 1902. Sergeant Thomas Halloran was sympathetic but dismissive. Men disappeared in cities. They drank too much. They jumped on freight trains. They drowned. They simply left. But across the North End, others were noticing. Maria Benedetti ran a boarding house on Hanover Street. Between 1902 and 1907, 6 of her tenants disappeared. All men, all single, all last seen heading toward the waterfront after receiving notes delivered by boys no one could identify. She kept the notes. They were identical. You have been chosen to see what lies beneath. Come to the old Mercer warehouse on Fleet Street at midnight. Bring no one, tell no one. The truth cannot be shared, only witnessed. Maria showed these to Father Corrigan in 1907. He brought them to police. They were dismissed. The warehouse had been investigated. Nothing but empty floors and broken windows. But the disappearances continued. By 1912, a reporter named Helen Marsh noticed a statistical anomaly. Working-class men from the North End were disappearing at a rate 3 times higher than any other demographic in Boston. She published an article titled, "The Vanishing Men of Boston's North End." The piece generated brief interest but no action, no bodies, no witnesses to crimes, just absence. Marsh kept digging. She found Samuel Byrne, a man who'd received a note but hadn't gone. Actually, he had gone. He'd arrived at the warehouse at midnight, found an opening in the basement floor, and climbed down 3 rungs of a ladder into darkness. Then he'd heard voices below. Multiple voices echoing up, all speaking in unison, chanting. Byrne had climbed back up and run. He never went back. Marsh returned to the warehouse with police in April 1912. They found the hatch, but the tunnel below had been sealed with stone and mortar. Professional work that would have taken days. The police concluded the tunnel no longer existed. Case closed. But Marsh believed whoever built it had relocated, and the disappearances would continue. Between 1912 and 1929, another 28 men vanished. Same pattern. Working class, unmarried, vulnerable. Several witnesses reported seeing them with a thin man with dark hair, a forgettable face, an unforgettable voice. By November 1929, 43 men had been reported missing, but there was still no evidence of a crime, just gaps in the population, just families who stopped asking questions. And then Daniel McCarthy's construction crew broke through the earth and found the tunnels. Among the 23 bodies recovered from Silas Thorne's central chamber, investigators identified 16 through personal effects and dental records. Let's meet 3 of them. Antonio Russo. Antonio was 34 when he disappeared in March 1902. He'd emigrated from Naples in 1897, fleeing poverty and seeking work, dignity, a future. He worked Boston's docks, 12-hour shifts, brutal labor, wages that barely covered rent. But Antonio was saving. He sent money home to his younger sister in Naples every month without fail. His dream was to bring her to Boston. On March 14, 1902, Antonio was drinking at a tavern when a man approached, thin, dark-haired, soft-spoken. The man asked if any of them had ever wondered why they broke their backs building warehouses for men who would never know their names. Antonio listened. The man asked if suffering brought people closer to God, or if God was indifferent to suffering entirely. Antonio said he believed God had a plan even when he didn't understand it. The man smiled. "What if I could show you what's beneath the plan?" 3 days later, Antonio received the note. He was last seen walking toward the waterfront at 11:30 p.m. Antonio's sister received his monthly payment in March, but not in April. She wrote letters that went unanswered. Eventually, she stopped writing. When investigators found Antonio's body in 1929, he was identified by a silver crucifix around his neck, a gift from his mother before he left Italy. The crucifix had been deliberately inverted. Antonio's sister, then 61, traveled from Naples to collect his remains. At his funeral, she asked the priest why God would allow her brother to suffer so far from home, for so long, without anyone searching for him. The priest had no answer. Thomas Brennan. Thomas was 41 when he vanished in September 1908, a Boston native who'd grown up in the North End. He'd been a promising student, but had to leave school at 14 to work in a textile mill after his father drank away the family money. He worked construction, skilled enough to find work but unreliable enough that he never kept jobs long. He drank. He had loud, bitter opinions about the church, the government, the immigrants taking jobs he believed should be his. But during lunch breaks, he'd sketch architectural designs in a notebook, bridges that would never be built, buildings no one had asked for. One evening in September, Thomas was drinking alone when a man approached and asked about his notebook. They talked for over an hour. The man seemed genuinely interested. He told Thomas he'd built a project that honored the workers, not the owners. That challenged the assumption that cathedrals should point toward heaven, when heaven had never done anything for the men who built them. Thomas left with him. His body was found in the central chamber 21 years later, positioned facing a wall carved with, "The work is the prayer, the worker is the God." In Silas Thorne's journal, there's an entry dated September 18, 1908. "The architect came tonight. He understood immediately. He wept when he saw what I'd built, not from horror but from recognition. He said it was the first honest structure he'd ever seen. I showed him the final chamber. He asked if he could stay. I told him that was always the choice." Thomas's mother filed a missing persons report in November 1908. It was dismissed. She died in 1915, never knowing what happened to her son. Peter Novak. Peter was the youngest, 26 when he disappeared in June 1918. He'd immigrated from Czechoslovakia in 1914, fleeing the war. Peter was different from Antonio and Thomas. He wasn't bitter or disillusioned. He was hopeful. He worked as a carpenter's apprentice, attended night classes to learn English, and wrote letters describing Boston as a city of possibilities. He also wrote poetry, in Czech mostly, about light, how it changed the color of buildings, how it reflected off the harbor, how it made even dirty streets look beautiful at dawn. In May 1918, Peter met a man at the Boston Public Library while reading about Gothic cathedrals. The man asked what fascinated him. Peter explained in halting English that he loved how cathedrals used light, how windows transformed sunlight into something sacred. The man asked if he'd ever considered the opposite, whether darkness could be designed with the same intentionality, whether the absence of God could be as structured as the presence of God. Peter didn't fully understand, but he was intrigued. Over the next month, they met 3 more times. Then Peter received a note. "I want to show you a structure that uses darkness the way cathedrals use light. Come alone. Some truths are not meant to be shared, only witnessed." Peter told his roommate he was going to see an architectural project. He left at 10 p.m. on June 8, 1918. When Peter's body was found in 1929, investigators discovered something haunting. In his pocket was a folded piece of paper. On it, Peter had written in careful English, "If I do not return, tell my family I saw something beautiful." Peter's family in Czechoslovakia received word of his death in 1930. The same week they learned Peter's younger brother had died in the war. They buried an empty casket in their village cemetery. Peter's body remains in Boston. The pattern. These 3 men were chosen carefully. Silas Thorne looked for men who were isolated, men whose absence wouldn't trigger immediate alarm, men who were vulnerable to the promise of meaning in a world that had given them very little. He also selected for doubt, men who questioned the structures around them, men who felt the dissonance between the world as promised and as experienced, men hungry for an explanation that made sense of their suffering, and he offered them one. Not salvation, but a different kind of truth, that the world was built by those who suffered for those who didn't, that God, if God existed, was complicit, and that the only honest response was to descend beneath the architecture of lies and confront the darkness that held everything up. Thorne's journals claimed he didn't restrain the men initially. He invited them in, showed them the chambers, explained his philosophy. then offered a choice. You can return to the surface and live as before, knowing now that the structures above are lies. Or you can stay here in the truth and help me finish the work. But the bodies tell a different story. Forensic analysis revealed evidence of malnutrition, dehydration, and blunt force trauma. Thorne's choice was an illusion. The tunnels disoriented by design, and once the men descended far enough, they couldn't find their way out. The only exit was death. When Daniel McCarthy climbed out of that pit on November 12, 1929, he called the city engineer's office. Lawrence Coleman responded, a man who'd worked for Boston Public Works for 17 years. He knew every tunnel, every basement, every underground structure in the city's records. The tunnels McCarthy found weren't in those records. Coleman descended with McCarthy and 2 assistants. What they found violated every principle of safe construction. The tunnels spiraled. They didn't follow the street grid. They looped back on themselves. Passages connected through crawlways that required moving on your stomach. And everywhere, walls, ceilings, floors, carved symbols and text. After 2 hours underground, Coleman admitted he'd lost his sense of direction. They had to follow their own chalk marks to find the exit. Coleman called the police that evening. Detective Sergeant Robert Flynn responded, a 22-year veteran who'd worked organized crime during Prohibition. His first assumption, bootlegging tunnels. But when Flynn descended the next morning with his team, they found no evidence of smuggling. They found something worse. In the central chamber, 30 feet in diameter with a vaulted ceiling, Flynn's team discovered the bodies. 23 human remains in varying stages of decomposition, all positioned deliberately, arranged in a circle facing inward toward a stone pedestal. On the pedestal, a journal, over 400 pages, handwritten, detailing 3 decades of construction, philosophy, and murder. The first entry was dated April 1894. Today I begin the excavation. The city above believes it has tamed the earth. I will show them what lies beneath. Not chaos, but a different kind of order. An architecture of truth. The final entry was dated September 1929. The work is nearly complete. 43 have seen the truth. 23 remain as witnesses. When the city finds this place, and they will call it a grave. But it is a cathedral, and I am its only honest priest. The journal was signed, Silas Thorne. Flynn issued a citywide alert. But there was a problem. No one had any record of that name after 1893. No arrest record, no address, no tax filings. Silas Thorne had erased himself from the surface world the moment he began building beneath it. Flynn's team cross-referenced the journal with missing persons reports. 16 of the 23 bodies matched unsolved disappearances. The other 7 couldn't be identified. No reports, no families searching. They'd vanished so completely that even their absence hadn't been noticed. One detective discovered that the land where the tunnel stood had been purchased in 1893 by a shell company called Architects Foundation Trust. The trust had paid taxes for 36 years, always on time. Its founder, Silas Thorne. That meant the tunnels had been under construction for over 3 decades in one of Boston's most populated neighborhoods. Investigators canvassed the north end with a photograph from 1890, a portrait of Silas at age 19. Thin, dark hair, pale skin, eyes that looked past the camera rather than at it. Dozens recognized the face, but descriptions were vague. He'd been at taverns, near construction sites, in the library, but no one remembered specific conversations. No one recalled where he lived. One bartender. He was the kind of man you'd forget the moment he left the room. That invisibility had been his greatest weapon. 3 weeks into the investigation, a break came from Helen Marsh's journals, donated to the Boston Public Library after her death in 1928. A librarian remembered them after reading newspaper coverage. Marsh had documented missing men from 1912 to 1925, witness testimony, and maps based on where men were last seen. Her maps, overlaid with Thorne's actual tunnels, matched with eerie accuracy. Investigators now believed Thorne was alive as late as 1929. But where? On December 3rd, police found a room on Fleet Street, recently occupied, a mattress, a lamp, books on philosophy and architecture, and on the wall, written in charcoal, The work is finished. The truth is buried. Let those who find it decide what it means. But Silas Thorne was gone. A train ticket receipt showed a one-way purchase to New York City, dated November 10th, but no passenger manifest, no hotel records, no trace. He'd vanished as completely as the men he'd taken into his labyrinth. The identification process took 6 months. Dr. Arthur Whitman, a forensic pathologist, led the investigation. 16 bodies were eventually identified. 7 remain unknown. Body identification brought terrible closure. Antonio Russo's crucifix, Thomas Brennan's dental records and healed arm fracture, Peter Novak's note and handwriting analysis. But Dr. Whitman's team also had to determine cause of death. The findings were disturbing. 12 bodies showed blunt force trauma to the skull, lethal injuries from a heavy object. 8 showed no trauma, death by starvation, dehydration, or exposure. 3 showed both trauma and prolonged malnutrition. Dr. Whitman's conclusion: the deceased were not killed quickly. The perpetrator invested significant time in each death. Some were killed outright. Others were allowed to die slowly, over days or weeks. The pattern suggests deliberate psychological cruelty. The perpetrator wanted victims to experience the labyrinth's conditions before death. One detail haunted investigators. The bodies had been moved after death and arranged in that circle. Thorne had positioned them as part of the architecture, witnesses to his work even in death. His journals confirmed it. He'd written extensively about the central chamber, which he called the Chapel of the Truthful Dead. He believed each person who died had seen through surface world lies and chosen to remain below. He saw himself not as their killer, but as their shepherd. One entry from May 1925. Today, the 14th witness completed his journey. He resisted at first, but I showed him the chamber. I showed him the others, and I asked, would you rather return to the lie or stay in the truth? He chose the truth. It took 11 days, but he chose. Forensic analysis matched this to an unidentified body, a man who died of starvation after approximately 2 weeks in the tunnels. Thorne had trapped people in his labyrinth, offered them a false choice, and let them die when they realized there was no exit. It wasn't enlightenment. It was murder by architecture. Antonio Russo's sister, Maria, stood at his grave in March 1930, 61 years old, having crossed an ocean to bury a brother dead for 28 years. She didn't cry. She'd cried herself empty on the voyage. Instead, she spoke in Italian to the priest. For 28 years, I imagined he forgot us. That was bearable. But this, knowing he never forgot, that he was alone in darkness all that time. She placed a photograph on the grave, Antonio smiling in Naples before America, then returned to Italy and never spoke his name again. Thomas Brennan's funeral drew 7 people. His cousin, who arranged it, wondered if Tommy had found in Thorne's tunnels what he'd sought his whole life, someone who shared his anger at the world's architecture. Peter Novak's family received his effects and the note, "If I do not return, tell my family I saw something beautiful." His mother's reply, translated from Czech, "My son believed in beauty even in darkness. This killed him. Please tell people, some darkness is just death. Some darkness is not art, only cruelty calling itself truth." The 7 unidentified bodies were buried together in April 1930. The gravestone, unknown but not forgotten. Maria Benedetti, the boarding house owner who'd kept Thorne's notes, stood at that grave and knew the truth. These men had been forgotten long before they died. That's why Thorne chose them. She placed 7 white flowers on the grave and made a promise. "I won't forget you now." For the rest of her life, Maria returned monthly. She never learned their names, but she remembered they'd existed. The survivors, Samuel Byrne, who'd climbed 3 rungs into the tunnel in 1912 and fled, couldn't sleep after the discovery. Every night. Why did I survive when 23 others didn't? He developed tremors, stopped eating. His wife found him whispering, "I could have told someone in 1912. Maybe Antonio, maybe Thomas, maybe the boy who wrote poetry." He was hospitalized for exhaustion in 1930, moved west, lived quietly until 1958. At his funeral, his daughter found a note, "I escaped Silas Thorne's tunnel, but I never escaped what I should have done after. The tunnels sealed. In March 1930, city workers began pouring concrete. 4 months. Passage by passage. The labyrinth disappeared beneath 50 tons of concrete. But they didn't fill everything. The central chamber was sealed but preserved. A steel door. A concrete wall. Locked. Officially preserved for evidence. Unofficially because no one knew what else to do with it. Detective Flynn kept the key. When he retired in 1945, he passed it to his successor. The key has moved from hand to hand for 95 years. The door has never been opened again. Local legend says you can still hear things in certain North End basements. Scraping, whispers, echoes of something that shouldn't exist, but refuses to be completely gone. What happened to Silas Thorne? He vanished. The manhunt lasted 18 months. Federal agents tracked leads to New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. All dead ends. Some believed he'd fled to Europe. Others believed he'd changed identities. A few believed he'd simply gone deeper, that somewhere beneath Boston in undiscovered tunnels, Silas Thorne lived out his final years in the darkness he'd excavated. In 1947, a subway worker found a small chamber off a utility tunnel, containing a bedroll, philosophy books, and carved symbols matching Thorne's work. Police investigated, concluded, homeless shelter. But the worker insisted, those carvings were fresh. I've been in these tunnels 20 years. That room wasn't there before. The chamber was sealed. Silas Thorne remains, officially, a fugitive, presumed dead, never proven. And in the North End, old-timers still tell the story of the man who hated God, who built a cathedral beneath the streets, filled it with forgotten dead, then disappeared into the labyrinth he'd created, and maybe never left at all. 95 years have passed since Daniel McCarthy found the tunnels. The victims are buried, the journals locked in archives, the labyrinth sealed beneath concrete. Boston continues above it all, building higher, moving faster, forgetting what lies beneath. But some things don't stay buried. The case changed how America treated missing persons, not because the system suddenly cared, but because Thorne proved how easily people could vanish when nobody was looking. The case entered folklore, novels, films, cautionary tales always carrying the same warning. Cities are built on darkness. Beneath every monument are forgotten names. The architecture we trust is held up by suffering we choose not to see. And the case left one question no investigation ever answered. When Silas Thorne carved "God is the architect of nothing" into those walls, was he describing his philosophy? Or was he describing himself? A man who spent 35 years building something vast and deliberate, who selected victims with care, who documented everything, then vanished before anyone could ask why. Maybe Thorne believed he was exposing truth about God's absence. Or maybe he was trying to become what he believed God should have been. An architect who admitted his creation was built on suffering, not salvation. Either way, beneath Boston's North End, behind a door that hasn't opened in 95 years, 23 witness marks remain carved in stone. 23 men who descended believing they'd been chosen for truth. They were chosen, just not for truth. For Silas Thorne's cathedral, for his message, for his proof that people will follow any voice that makes their suffering sound like meaning. The door stays locked. The chamber waits in darkness. Every year, someone places 7 white flowers on the grave of the unknown dead, a tradition started by Maria Benedetti in 1930, continued by strangers who refuse to let them be forgotten twice. The tunnels are gone, but the darkness they represented remains. Not beneath Boston, inside it, inside every city, inside every structure and every person we choose not to see. Silas Thorne didn't create that darkness. He just gave it architecture. And somewhere, in sealed chambers or filed reports, that architecture still stands, waiting for someone to find it and ask the same question Thorne asked his victims. Would you rather return to the lie or stay in the truth? Most choose the lie. It's safer, comfortable, lets you sleep at night. But 23 men chose differently. And their choice is carved in stone beneath a city that spent 95 years trying to forget they existed. Remember them. Antonio, Thomas, Peter, the 7 without names. Remember they were real, that they mattered, that they vanished into a labyrinth built by a man who believed suffering was the only honest prayer. And remember, the door to that labyrinth is still there, locked, waiting, holding darkness someone decided was too dangerous to destroy, but too terrible to open. What lies beneath is not just stone and concrete, it's a question Boston never answered. How many others vanished into darkness we haven't found yet?